there, and thank you, Ellen.
You're very welcome.
Now, the journal series, journal makes me think first of words or language. And an example of that is, sorry, nervous. An example of that is tic-tac-toe or ... You can see, oh, I'm not going to go with the image. So anyway, these are a couple of the plain things that occur during the beginning of my paintings. I thought I was doing something new, and then, as always, along come the one-by-one parade of artists who've done this aspect, that aspect, and yet still there's something that draws me to this series, some sort of spark between me and the works that I hope to pass along to you. Sometimes the paintings are good, sometimes they work well with the words, sometimes they're sort of at odds with the words or verbal content. One thing these paintings have in common is that they're all traditional. They're all oil on canvas, on rectangular canvas for that matter, and I even paint on an easel. Composition-wise, I started by working on a grid, by 8x10 grids of 3-inch squares. Soon I added in 4-inch squares to the mix and often worked in quadrants. So this is evident in much of my work. The lettering is often made in a different order than it's read. So if you look at this painting, Tom Buff, you can see the words Tom written vertically on the drums. And I make, with a pencil and ruler, all of the vertical lines in the letters first. So T has 1 vertical, O has 2, and M has 3. And this is not something that I would want anyone to know necessarily. The reason I bring it up is because when I'm putting the words into the paintings, they're often just as much pictorial elements for me as they are elements of language or as they're supposed to have symbolic meaning. So there's quite a bit of repetition. I just mentioned Tom Buff. There are 3 other Tom paintings with just one color that varies between them. And I often joke about the 7-pound index card because I use pre-stretched canvases on very good wooden stretchers, and the finished weight of my paintings is just under 7 pounds. Yet I want them to be like index cards so that the viewer is getting the same idea, slightly varied again and again, and getting that information. So unlike studying for a test with index cards, whatever the viewer sees is valid. And what I would encourage is just to keep looking, that the verbal content of the paintings is merely to keep people with them. And so I would say in that sense, a journal is not so much, is not really what I'm doing, because I'm making something intended for an audience, which a journal is not. So I'm gonna flip it back to Ellen.
All right. So thank you, Adam. This comes up, it's really, every time I talk to you about this, I get new ideas. So the work looks simplistic visually when you first start to think about it and look at it, but actually there's always a lot going on. So I think, one of the first things that always comes to my mind is, and I've always asked you this question kind of over and over, is because you have this mathematical background, can you tell me a little bit about, how your background and your interest have gelled into making this art, and perhaps specifically to this series?
Sure. I think specifically this series, although it is verbal and using words, I think it's very much more akin to a mathematical language than it is, English, or the typical way we would write and speak English, which is not always very natural for me. So I have a mathematics degree, a BA from Colorado College in Colorado Springs from the 2002. And I definitely, there were aspects that were a turnoff. And I know a friend of mine in the audience is involved in math and was my math tutor for a little while. So I'm a little hesitant of what to say, but I definitely think, you can get turned on to some really cool things, and you can also get turned off with some really technical things. And the other thing I would say is I live now in Haverford, Pennsylvania, which is one town over from where I was born and where I went to high school, in the suburbs of Pennsylvania, or the suburbs of Philadelphia, rather. And I went to a small independent school, and we each did senior independent projects. And my senior independent project was transcendence through physical exertion. And for the culmination of my project, I ran 40 miles, just not in a race or anything, just like around a loop that I had determined where we used to ride our bikes. And I think that was a pretty poetic project looking back on it. And that was always sort of, before I got into art, I think I was, definitely skirting around it. I spent my junior spring in London studying art history and Shakespeare and modern plays, which I could make better sense of. And so, I definitely was sort of going back and forth searching for something, and then I ended up zeroing in on art and also creative writing, both memoir and fiction, which, I think I've made part of my painting. So
yeah. I think they somebody said in the chat, just like Adam to casually drop, he ran 40 miles once because he thought it'd be a cool thing to do.
Thank you, S.
Thank you. So I think what is interesting here is always, in so many artists, there's a nexus between either a hard science or a mathematics and aesthetics. And I find that that is something that I see over and over again. And I think that bringing that extra information really helps to inform your work. And so maybe, I know you talked a little about your interest in art, but maybe you could specifically describe a little bit about the evolution of the journal series, because I think that is really interesting here to kind of bring that to the fore.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Ellen. So the journal series, it started very flat. My paintings for a while have been compared to tapestries, and often there were the whole canvas would be covered with evenly spaced words, maybe running in different directions. I'm thinking of a particular painting early on, but one of the things that happened was I started spacing out and varying the size of the letters and words. So there were places you could enter into the painting and there was depth. And I don't necessarily think one is better than the other. I really liked this idea of an art object, and I still do. And when I crafted my answer to this question, I was sort of thinking, well, I mean, I wish I was painting like that still, more like a flat wall, but things just evolve, and they don't necessarily evolve in a linear way. I think one of the things that happens is I'll take the color out of my work and just use black and 3 grays. and then I'll start to put it back in. So that's something interesting. And that's really, in general, what I have for that.
Okay, I mean, I think maybe if it would be okay, you might want to share another one of your paintings, simply because I think it will help illustrate what you're talking about, because this idea of playing with color, line, form, and depth is just a continuing process, and the permutations of your work as it goes, we go through different forms, is just always so interesting. So in this work, Forest Dark, you really can see this playing with line, color, form, letters, and the colors seem, these little pops of color really do help to kind of keep the eye moving around the canvas. And I would also like to note that what I like are the 4 quadrants. It's almost like you have the X and Y axis, right? And then you have, positive, negative space. So just in terms of conceptualization, I think that's really fascinating. And I really do appreciate, kind of this playing. And then in the boxes, you have these, you could have just had a black line, but you have these spots instead. So I've always wanted to ask you, what made you create these dotted lines in between the 4 quadrants of the work?
That's a really good question. I've been using the dashes since the beginning of the series, since the first or second painting of what's now more than 60. And for the life of me, I think at first it seemed like it was, if I couldn't draw a perfectly straight line, it was easier to make a series of dashes. But I think sometimes too, it becomes a device. I mean, it becomes a part of the painting. So it's but again,
I like that they elements come and go from your paintings, and they sometimes reappear on and off. The idea of creating positive, negative space. You almost look like you could stand up on a little platform in each of these quadrant paintings and jump off into, something else interesting that's going on. It's almost inviting you into a little land, different field of perception or vision, which I think comes from having sort of this mathematical background, this idea of playing with form, line, color, space, quadrants. I think that all comes from that. I don't know that it's always top of mind for you. I think you just create, but I do think it comes into that, which I really find fascinating. I guess sort of like the next thing that I wanted to ask you was, why is this series so important to you and to the evolution of your work? Because I really think it is. I've watched the series develop over time. And I think it's really interesting to be able to have the privilege to watch an artist develop a body of work over several years, because you really do see, the advancement, not necessarily, and when you say evolution, one is not more advanced than the other, but you see the change over time and the development of the work. And I happen to like the early paintings as much as I like the ones that we've just posted today on Art Now Media. I think they're really quite cool. So
yeah,
so maybe you could just talk a little bit about, why it's so important and why you continue to go to the well with these.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think one of the things that's important and that you touched on is this notion of being able to reinvent yourself, but either get back to or stay in sort of the same group that you were. And it's not, this is going to sound the opposite of what I want to say, but for me, making these, they're really important to me because they're not special day paintings. They fit my daily working habits, and technically they're not too specialized. I mean, so it's the kind of thing that either drawing or on the canvas or, in my mind while I'm reading a book, I can really sort of wade into this little bit of inspiration and sort of stretch it out into something that's, something that's a doable painting. And I think as the series gathers momentum, the interesting thing that happens is not only are you sort of quoting other people, but you're quoting yourself. And you also have a lot more margin for error. I mean, you can make a painting that wouldn't have fit into the series earlier and may not still, but 2 months later it will. And so I think it's sort of like safety in numbers in that way. So this, this series has just been a real boon for me, and in different ways. And I just wanted to quickly
Hold on one second. Let me just make you host again so you can.
oh,
Okay. You can share
Okay.
another image if you'd like.
okay, thanks. So I just wanted to quickly share this. This is one of my most recent pictures, stripe wide gray, and it's supposed to be 3 hashtags in the middle of the painting. And I think, yeah, again, you see the dashes around the perimeter of the painting, and I sort of brought those back for these. And it's just, there's nothing particular. I think it's sort of, it's plain in the look of it, but, and it may look thin, but, I still certainly think conceptually, and as far as the introduction of a different color background wash, these still seem to work. So I just wanted to show you that quickly, if you have anything to say on that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to see how we have the dotted lines again, but used in a completely different way. And then you have the lines in the background, light gray, dark gray, with the yellowish or ochre color that you always talk about behind to help create that sense of space and the overlap. So for me, I always see sort of the visual component. I'm always drawn back to what I know about you and your personality. It seems very simplistic, but actually it's deceptively so. There's actually a lot going on, and you really have to look at the paintings for a while to see all these things happening. And I think that's one of your gifts, to be able to create these images where you control for so many things, and then you can allow people into this different world, all you see. So is it all you see? Is it all I see? Is it all we see? I think that's kind of also interesting and funny. And I also think that, when there's a painting atom or a group of atoms paintings that have film on them, and we were talking about this a little bit yesterday. So I'd love for you to put that painting up, because I'd like to take a minute to talk about it, because I just think it's very interesting. Yes. So these film paintings, they're both sort of harking back to the idea of real, celluloid film, right? For either a camera or, a film projector. There's the idea of film. There's the idea of a progression going from one quadrant to the other. There's the playing with the words to spell out film. And the idea of going from beginning, middle to end and top to bottom, it adds a deeper level of meaning to me. And it's such a great way to, somebody said, such an interesting piece that flows. And I really do agree that even the grid in the background helps to create that sense of space, line, and form, which really makes it such a fun image to look at. And in the days of everybody looking at everything digitally, it's cool that Adam is kind of bringing us back to the idea of playing in 3 dimensions in a 2-dimensional space, just like actual film does, as well as how canvases do. So, kind of going into that a little bit, I wanted to ask, how did you choose your working parameters for the series? Because like you talked a little bit about how you did this, and then I had asked you yesterday, and I thought this was such a nice thing, you don't just do one, you do multiples of, like you'll do 4 at a time that are related. How did you kind of get to the size? You always have the same size canvas, and then color, shapes, and forms. There's great similarity, and you kind of created your own working language for this series. So I just want to know a little bit more about how that developed.
The size of the canvases started with the ratio of a 4 wide to 5 high. And then I was working very large, and someone said, well, why don't you, make those smaller and I'll sell them. So, and then I had to ask someone else, and she said, yeah, she said, a medium-sized canvas, a 24 by 30 canvas is really, it's good for an apartment, it's good for a condo. So that's from, the viewer's point of view or viewer's vantage. But the maker, me, for one thing, my studio is not that big. And I tried to drag in some 4 by 5 foot canvases, but and you can fit them in the studio. It's just not big enough to work on multiple canvases of that size. So more and more over the last, I'd say 5 or 8 years, I've come to settle on this size. And as far as color, the colors are something I've come to learn over time. And they're often opaque.
Yeah.
One example of a color that is not opaque is yellow ochre. And I think that's really the only color you can see in the background of this painting. You can see also above the middle hash mark and to the right of the top, there are these, you can see the white marks from applying the background. And it looks nice that it's semi-transparent here, but in general, it's just for a pretty simple reason that I use the opaque colors. I just like to be able to overpower another color if I need to write over it. And I don't like to get too involved in like very specific relationships between partly mixed colors. So I don't mix colors. I use them straight out of the tube with a little bit of medium. And again, doing this and fixing the size of the canvas, it's just sort of eliminating variables. And I think it frees up my attention for other things. And yeah, I think as far as form and shape, I would say I like to keep it pretty rudimentary. I mean, if there's something that I can't measure out with my ruler and my pencil, there's not a lot of divergence from the plan. There is some, and I think also I'm getting better at measuring. So I'm getting away from the grid and I'm getting in towards more, more sophisticated stuff, which to me feels as much like art as applying paint does. So
Yeah. I mean, I like the fact that you talk about, too many variables, because again, you go back to the idea of math and your roots and this continuing sort of saga of, the development of this group of paintings. I guess, I wanted to ask, where do you think the work is going? Where do you think, maybe you could comment a little on what are sort of the influences when you go into the studio and you said, okay, I finished this statement, right? This body of this sort of 4 paintings that I'm going to do in this grouping. How do I pick the next one? Or what sort of inspires you to go to the next one?
So I showed you a couple of the hashtag paintings, and those paintings, I mean, are coming off of about 60 paintings with almost all but 2 of them having a medium gray wash in the background. And so then to make, 3 out of 4 paintings all in different colored washes, I'm just sort of, I guess in a way, trying to throw some parameters out the window and see what happens.
Yep.
I think the other thing is the format. I'm sticking with the same size canvas, but I'm right now working on horizontal paintings.
Mm-hmm.
So I just have to make it interesting for me and hope that, that's what's interesting. I mean, I really have to stay involved and, definitely not, I mean, you don't want it to get boring for yourself. I think that's one of the reasons I don't write, is because a lot of writers you can tell they're interested in what they're doing. And I was always sort of trying to write a list. So it was boring to me.
Okay, well, thank you. So sort of one of my last formal questions is, how does your personality background continue to affect the work's evolution? And I think we kind of have part of the answer to that, but I just wanted to kind of take a minute to sort of think, have you think a little bit to see if there's anything else out of the descriptive things that we've talked about that you might want to say.
One of the things I would just mention is the sort of, if you look at this, all you see, I mean, it's sort of almost has a question mark at the end of it. So I think there's often a contemplative aspect to me and my head. And I think these 4s too, it's sort of like they're just sort of almost like whoops, messed that up. Sorry.
That's
They're
okay.
almost like written music, but they're not necessarily meant to be performing or anything. So
Do you listen to music while you paint?
I don't. I listen to music to take a break.
That's interesting. Okay. All right. So I thought we could take a few minutes and see if there are a lot of really interesting comments in the chat, but if anybody has any specific questions or additional thoughts that you'd like to share, and I can read them out loud if there's anything that people want to mention. I'm just going to expand this so I can see it. and I'm just gonna reclaim host, so if you want to show another painting, you can tell me, Adam, and we'll do it.
Oh, no, go for it.
So I like that, some people have said, if I can't do a straight line, I go for dashes. You probably learned this in math class. It's what we do. You can't prove it all in the integers, try proving it for the evens. So I like that a lot because, it just feels very, it feels very true. Betsy said, I like the dashes as a method to divide the series, moves my eye through the work. Okay, somebody asked, how did you decide what and how much color to use?
Thanks. Should I take that?
Sure, yes, please do.
So often I go back to black and white when I'm working something out compositionally, and in a way, it's a sort of safe zone. But at the same time, there's a lot that can be said with just black and three grays. And I think usually when I'm working well, the painting is telling me. So it would say, not in words, but it would say, you need to just pay attention and not be a star and use, overwhelm everyone with color, but, maybe use, as we discussed this morning, Mom, just, achromatic color with a touch of color in the middle. Or, usually there's some sort of balance involved in what works out well. And I'd say if it's all achromatic, maybe that's hiding too much from, people who might enjoy the paintings better if it had a little bit of color in it.
Cool. All right. Thank you. So somebody said, love the dimensional aspects of these pieces. How did you come up with the name Tom for one of your paintings?
Thank you. The name Tom comes from a drum, like tom people have heard of. And I also looked up, I was Googling, and it said, I guess a tom is a name of a drum in a common sort of rock and roll drum kit. So that's where that comes from. And
Cool.
it's meant to be like an octagonal drum.
Okay. So, let's see. Somebody asked, what inspires you? Where do you get your inspiration?
Well, a lot of my inspiration is from walking. Both, I live right next door to a college and they have a beautiful nature trail, but I also often just walk to get my groceries or walk on this sort of main type 4-lane street. And I just find that the movement itself is very meditative. And I certainly look at art, but usually I'm painting, and a lot of times looking at art or reading in criticism is not conducive to that. So
okay. How do you decide the title of your works, Adam?
the title of my work usually comes from the painting. I can think of, often in this series, it tends to come from the words that are in the painting. So it could be dots one size, dots two sizes, because the dots are either one size or they're two different sizes in the respective paintings. It could refer to a color in a particular painting. Interestingly, in these most recent stripe paintings that I've shown, the paintings with the hashtags, they're actually named after the thickness and color of the stripes directly above the horizontal dark gray stripes. So it's just, so the names aren't always to do with the words, but they usually have to do with the paintings and are as convenient as I can find of a way to describe them.
And then how do you, here's a question. Chris just asked, how do you know when a series is finished? Just always a interesting thing to ask artists.
That's a great question. I mean, because you don't want to let like just a stiff breeze like keep you from, you know, continuing with the series. So you really have to bring, you know, you have to bring some energy to fight the resistance that's always telling you, oh, you know, everyone's done this before, you know, you can just quit. But at the same time, I mean, it can get stale. What I will say about this series is a lot of times I've just done, in the case of the film paintings, I thought that was a departure and was going to be something else. I actually kept that without getting a photograph for a couple months. But I tend to keep coming back to this series, and I don't know if that'll be the case in the future, but I think sometimes the only way you know, like, if a series is finished, if you just stop making work in it. I mean, if you do something else or, yeah.
Yes. So somebody just asked, do you sometimes feel like you can't escape an idea? That's a really interesting question.
Yes, definitely, but not so much anymore. As I said, with, you know, why is this work important to me? I mean, they're not special day paintings where I'm in the throes of, you know, enormous creativity. They're paintings that I can live with on a day-to-day basis. And I definitely get obsessed. Like, there'll be times when I'm making drawings and I'll be sitting reading a book or something, and I can't stop from getting up and changing the drawing, even though I know I'm not going to do any better that day. So there's that, but there's nothing worse than that.
You can't escape. You're going around and around. Kind of like a Jean-Paul Sartre play. All right, here's a good question. Have you ever changed the words in a painting after starting or even after finishing it? I would like to know the answer to that.
That's a good question. Thanks, Glenn. I know that I've made new versions of the paintings with different words and just, but as far as if I ever changed the words in a painting after starting, I often make 2 or 3 oil sketches, I call them, which are basically, you know, canvases of the same size in oil paint, but before I know exactly what I'm doing. And often the words in those will change, but by the time I'm making the finished paintings that you would see on the Art Now Media website, I'm not really changing that drastically. I'm more working on the finer points.
So Alexandra asked, do you have favorites? Do you have ones you forget you made? I like that. Do you have favorites? Or are they all like your children? You love them equally?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, S. I think it's pretty vain of me to have ones I forget I made and think, oh, that's my favorite, you know, but I think yeah, it's like that poet thing. Like, I remember Rilke like sent his pupil like a copy of his poem printed in his own hand, and it was like, you know, he wanted him to see how it looked printed in someone else's hand. But do I have favorites? Absolutely I do, but they change. I mean, and I'm always wary, because obviously the ones I've done more recently are my favorites, and I have to always be wary of that, because that's a trap. But So I think the favorites are changing. And I think for the time being, I pretty much remember all the ones I've made.
It's getting to be quite a big list, even over the last couple years. You know, it's really quite an accomplishment to have such a, you know, such a interesting, determinedly so body of work. The longer an artist keeps going with a body of work, the more contemplative it becomes, but it can often become really difficult to keep it going in a significant way. So I really, my hat's off to you to just that you've kept it going for so long. So we'll take a few more questions. Do you find that your mood affects your painting?
Oh, 100%, Denny. Yeah. I mean, I definitely tend to paint more in gray and black when I'm having a low mood or like during the winter. And that's not a hard and fast rule, but I think my mood absolutely affects it. And one of the reasons I'll go back to this question, why is this series important to me, is because it gets me beyond that. I mean, it seems to have a way of getting me out of my head and into this sort of other thing, this body of work that is not dependent on me.
Interesting. Do you sometimes set out to make one you don't like? That's an interesting question.
No.
I would concur, because I feel like they're very loved by you. I can tell they're a labor of love. So Betsy asked, what comes first, the word or the layout design?
That's a great question, Bets. I think they come at different times. I think initially the words were coming first, and then the design would come after. Lately, I'm finding I'm fitting the words into the design, which is interesting because I think the words have meaning. I think they should have meaning to the viewer, but at the same time, part of the reason I choose the words is because they fit in a given space.
Okay. Well, I don't know if there are any other questions, but I guess we'll kind of take a pause here. I wanted to thank everybody. While you're thinking, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming again and participating so fully, which is so nice that everybody's been commenting. I really do appreciate it, and Adam appreciates it. And, you know, I think if you want to see more of this series, you can go to artnowmedia.com. It's in the chat, but it's pretty self-evident. Interesting. There are two last questions, which I think are relevant. Have you ever sold a painting that you wish you hadn't? And do you ever want to work or show drawings on paper?
I've given away paintings I wished I hadn't. I find lately, if I sell a painting, I'm really glad when people buy one that I really like, because that just makes me happy. Whereas, you know, I could want to hoard the ones I like, but I definitely, you know, love when people I like get a painting I like. And do I want to work or show drawings on paper? I don't know. That's a hard question. I'm so wedded to my own world of canvas, and I also think it's more durable, but I'll have to see. And
I don't
what
know. It would be interesting to see how the juxtaposition between these really structured canvases, and you might play on paper a little bit more. It might be a little freeing, but I don't know. We don't know. We'll have to tune in and see what happens. So again, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. I've just put my email in the chat if you want to join the mailing list for other events, which I will have some more Zoom calls coming up in the not too distant future. Or if you have any questions for Adam or his work, I'm happy to forward them to him, although I know a lot of you are already already connected to him, but still I offer that option. And I really wanted to thank everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. And it's been wonderful to have Adam here and speak so freely and forthrightly about his work. So thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
And I think we'll